My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. This is a lecture on the early work of Louis Kahn for my course on Kahn and Venturi, fall 2015. So quite a few architects don't come out of the box fully developed. You can look at early Frank Lloyd Wright and he's capable, but it's straight out of the shingle style. Richard Meyer is exceptional, but his first building was full-blown Richard Meyer. So maybe he kept secret anything else he did. I just want the architects control what, try to control what's published. Kahn was a particularly late bloomer and is really fully mature, developed, world-class buildings, medical towers, and he was about 60 years old when he did that. So there's a lot of early work that's going to get us there. So Kahn died young, 73, I think I'm 73. Very stressful life, deeply in debt, doing huge projects in India and Pakistan, flying back and forth. The governments are not paying him, he's in debt. Those are long flights, died of a heart attack. Sort of aware that some architects are dedicated to teaching, some are practitioners, and a few are both. Kahn was both. And he was probably equally important as a practitioner and a teacher. An example of that today might be Peter Eisenman, who tries to practice. I don't know how, some of his stuff is important, but also is a major figure in architectural education. This is an old building by Frank Furness, for whom Sullivan worked before he went to Chicago. And it was a library, and Kahn's studio was right up there. Now, Kahn was working in Philadelphia, like quite a few Philadelphia School architects, and was a term Philadelphia School, for what went on between maybe 1955 and maybe 1980. And a lot of these architects were very dedicated to the city. It was really, they had an organic relationship with the city, and they were part of a unique synergy of city, profession, and school. So profession. There's an emerging new young bunch of architects, post-World War II architects. Many of them taught at the school. So now profession and school are tied together. Philadelphia was undergoing an urban design renewal led by Edmund Bacon. And he, for the City Planning Commission, really didn't build anything, but it would say, we propose to redevelop this area. And they'd get one of the faculty members, who's also a young professional, to do the designs for that. That would not be built, but would be published, and someone else would eventually build something. And if you look at Manhattan, lower Manhattan is about the size of downtown Philadelphia, Center City, Philadelphia. So it was comprehensible. You can walk from one end of Philadelphia to the other in, say, an hour. Can't do that in Manhattan. So William Penn laid out what's called the Penn's 5 squares. So there's a square here, 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 and here. Broad Street, Market Street. Now the city started here and moved on the Delaware River, moved toward the Schuylkill River, but kept this grid laid out by William Penn. Then in the 1920s, this diagonal parkway is cut, and it's modeled after the Champs-Élysées in Paris. And then on a hill up here is the Philadelphia Museum. That's where you see Rocky run up the steps in the Rocky movies. Then this is a Schuylkill River, and this is West Philadelphia, and the university is right here. So, 1951, we get a new dean at Penn. Penn is a Beaux-Arts school, and totally out of date. And so they brought in a new dean, G. Holmes Perkins, who was chair of city planning at Harvard. And he puts together this faculty. Now, there's a lot of key people, but for our story, key people are Kahn, Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, Marius Venturi, and Edmund Bacon is in the city planning department, and he's the one overseeing the redesign of the city. Philadelphia School is culturally oriented, sees history as a continuum. It's very concerned about the urban context. How does your building fit in the city? You don't just make a glass bubble and drop it in the middle of an old city. Plan as generator of meaning. We'll see that in Kahn's work. And structure as an ordering element. And so we're going to be talking about that as we go through Kahn, but it's true of all of these figures. So Kahn is the key leading figure, but is also part of what we call the Philadelphia School. So just a very quick biography. Miracle of modern technology. Watch this. So Kahn was born in Estonia to a poor Jewish family, immigrated to Philadelphia when he was 5. So he's essentially an American. He grew up, from the age of 5 on. Studied architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, which was a Beaux-Arts school. I'd rather not turn on the air conditioner, but should I get a fan? How many people would like a fan? Raise your hands. Okay, hang on, be right back. Have the air move around a bit. So air conditioning makes a lot of noise. So Kahn went to the University of Pennsylvania. At the time of Beaux-Arts school, chief critic there was Paul Philippe Cray, who we mentioned when we talked about the Beaux-Arts. Graduated in 1924, at a time when Beaux-Arts architecture was fading, modern architecture was rising, and he was very active. He did a couple of different firms until 1951. His buildings were socially based. 1929, you have the stock market crash, beginning of the Depression, and so architects became very concerned with social issues, housing for the poor, stuff like that. And Kahn was involved in that, and his buildings were they were not good. They were very undistinguished. 1951, it starts getting interesting, and 1960, he's suddenly emerges on the scene as one of our most important architects. One of Kahn's classmates was the first American to go to Paris and work for Le Corbusier, and brought back a bunch of Corbu books. And Kahn says of the 1930s, I lived in a city called Corbu, pouring through these books, absorbing modern architecture, which had never been mentioned in his education. So this is the nature of his education. This is a building from around 1904, the Pan Am building in Washington, D.C. Now, if we're standing here, right about over there is the Vietnam Memorial, just so you know where it is in Washington. Beautiful little Beaux-Arts building by Paul Philippe Cray. And here in 1929, he does the Shakespeare Folger Library, and it's called Strict Classicism Style, trying to respond to modern architecture by making large, plain surfaces. And Kahn worked on this building, having gotten out of school 5 years earlier, was working for Cray. Now, at that time, you did Beaux-Arts schemes, like I showed you 2 weeks ago, and a lot of, you didn't have to, but a lot of studios would submit the best student projects to New York for a competition. And there would be prizes, you know, it might be a Prix de Rome prize. And if you're judged the best project, you get a year's scholarship in Rome, or Paris, or whatever. So that was the educational system that Kahn grew up in. Here is a silver medal project that, of Kahn's when he was a student. It's called a shopping center, I would say. It's maybe more of a department store. And you see here how the grid is structural grid is part of what determines the spaces. And this is going to be very important in Kahn's later work. This is, there was something called the Sesquicentennial, 1926 was the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and there was a big World's Fair in Philadelphia. Very undistinguished. Nobody ever wrote about it. Kahn worked for the architect doing that. This is one of his drawings. This is the Buffalo Crate project he worked on. And after school, he went to Europe and then traveled around Europe, Greece, Egypt, and made these very bold drawings. So he's preparing himself. These are some of the drawings he did, kind of picking up a kind of modernism of the time. These are Greek ruins, these very bold colors. The color's not there in the architecture. It's the way Kahn's doing them. Here's the Acropolis. More Greek ruins. Anybody know what this is? It's the town square in Siena, very famous for this curving wall. Here's a building Kahn did in 1935, a Jewish synagogue, and boy, is that undistinguished. There's nothing here you'd want to write home about. Very bold use of concrete in this big span. Totally, it looks like a garage entrance or something to the entrance, so very undistinguished. This is Roosevelt, New Jersey, a development of low-income housing, projects built during the Depression, and so it's very international style, white, flat roofs, and people just hate flat roofs. Here I'm on a tour of this thing, and I take this picture out the window. People putting second stories on with shed roofs, you know. And under the influence of Corbu, he's redoing Philadelphia. So here's Corbu's Ville Radieuse, and Corbu applies this kind of a grid to Paris. He's got, Corbu proposes we do Paris. So here, in this hyper-rationalism, Kahn is straightening out the Delaware River, emphasizing the Market Street and Broad Street and Market Street, tearing down City Hall, putting up these towers in the park, making the super grid of blocks and then the individual units. So he's redesigning from the street grid of the city all the way down to the individual units. He's redesigning the whole city. And some architects are trained to think egotistically like that. Here's some more projects from the 40s for Center City, Philadelphia. He's leaving the tower of City Hall but tearing the rest of it down, putting up these slabs. No sense of order, no clear idea what it's about. It's just these bold, modern structures. And here's a stadium supported by these round, big round arches, maybe reminiscent of Corbu's Palace of the Soviets. And what's this going to be like? What's it like to walk down here? You know, what kind of space does this make? Well, modern architecture wasn't concerned about that. They're concerned about their bold structures. Later, he's thinking about redoing the city of Philadelphia. Now, all this would be valuable. I think it should be part of a city planner's education, because there are now whole cities being built in China and the Middle East from scratch. And it would be nice if there's some of the ideas, thinking, and experiences of modern architecture be incorporated in what's being done. But anyway, here Kahn sees there's all this traffic, and it's everywhere. And he says, you know what? First of all, let's keep the cars out as much as possible. So there are these giant parking garages, big round structures. And you pull in there, and then you can walk or take a bus inside the city. If you go in the city, there's what he calls ghost streets and stop streets. So ghost streets are through thoroughfares, stop streets are little local streets. And so he's trying to bring some order to the city. And he's thinking in terms of the sports stadium. Here's the Diagonal Parkway to the museum, museum's here, sorry. City Hall is gone, which was a great stone building. Now, Philadelphia's really proud of it. But in a modern era, any old building was, you know, something you wanted to tear down. So here's City Hall, mostly gone. Here are Penn's 5 squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And he puts this new sports stadium here. 1956-63, Kahn gets the opportunity to do public housing. So we have public housing everywhere, the projects. Maybe if we went upstairs in this building, we could see some out the window. They're built all over. In New York, they've been reasonably successful. You know, a lot of crime, a lot of problems. But in other cities like Philadelphia, they're such a disaster. Most of them have been dynamited. So this is Mill Creek Public Housing by Kahn. Here, he's using concrete lintels to make a cover over the entrance. He's having Corbu's brise-soleils, making these balconies, protecting you from the sun. And it's like, you think the people living there really care about that? The thing was a total disaster, and it was torn down. So Kahn pretends it never happened. Doesn't talk about it. So here are these concrete overhangs. Like, that's going to make the thing more livable. And here are the balconies. Now, you got this balcony, and you've got 3 kids. They're going to go off the balcony. So there's floor to ceiling chain mesh cyclone fencing. And you go there, and the kids are like glommed onto this. You know, this kid, climbing on the fencing, just sort of looking out. Kahn did some houses, and we're not going to talk about them in this course. I find them very uninteresting. Here's some housing built during the war for it was needs for lots of housing near military factories, military bases, etc. He's got these concrete fins making the parking down here, the unit up here, puts the window up against the roof. So there's some interesting architectural ideas here. And there are in each of his houses, but we're not going to talk about them. He's experimenting with new materials. So here's a project, not built, for a kind of public space using modern steel. And it's kind of, he's thinking of how the cathedrals here at Beauvais use flying buttresses, and it was all done in masonry. But now, with lightweight steel, we can achieve the ambitions of the Gothic builders with extremely light structures, and then these are plastic skylights up here. So he's thinking about these new materials, steel and plastic, and then he abandons them, and he says, reminiscent of the way this looks, I believe that the buildings of the future will look like giant spiders, but I personally am more comfortable with masonry. So he's going to work with concrete and brick as opposed to lightweight steel. Here are the houses. Now we see how structured, look at the columns on this thing. I mean, it's a little house. This could hold up a 10-story building. But he's exploring structure as an organizing force. Here, the grid as an organizing force in these houses. I was on a tour once, and we're visiting this one. I don't remember which one this is. And it's in a totally ordinary suburban neighborhood. And here's this very modern thing with vertical wood planking. And we're standing around looking at it, and I said, does anybody notice somebody dropped a packing crate in the middle of this neighborhood? And everybody pretended they didn't know me, you know, sort of walked off. Because you're supposed to worship Kahn, you can't criticize him. Now, it starts to get interesting. This is the first project to really pulls together some ideas. Does not get built, but Trent Jewish Community Center, 5459. So it's, here's the community center, here's the swimming pool, here's the bathhouse where you change into your swimming trunks, and this did get built. This did not, but this is very interesting. We see here these units, there's kind of a grid sense, and so we look here and we see a grid, and it's wide span, narrow span, wide span, narrow span, wide span, narrow span, wide span, narrow span. And he really tells you that we've got this grid here by putting these little pavilions on it. So it really emphasizes these spaces. And then he gathers the spaces. Sometimes one of these spaces will be a room, offices, classrooms. These narrow spans are good for corridors. Maybe some corridors. And then he can leave out 4 columns and get a big multi-purpose room, leave out a bunch of the columns, get a gym, and then we're going to have big beams up here for the gym, so these columns get beefed up because they're carrying these big beams. So we have a hierarchy of these columns from little squares to L shapes to big squares when they're carrying these big beams. Again, big squares carrying these big beams. Now, this is a rejection of Le Corbusier's 5 points toward a new architecture. And Corbu had said, the columns become points, and once we make them out of steel or concrete, we no longer need bearing walls. Columns hold up the building, and then the walls become partition walls that can go anywhere. And Kahn says, no, you can't do that. He says, here are your columns. Now, the columns metaphorically create a division between this side and this side. He says you cannot sleep in 2 rooms at the same time. Of course you can, but you shouldn't. So that these columns imply an architectural order and shows how the spaces should be carried out. So this doesn't get built, but it's a really strong idea for an organizing architecture. Instead, they built this by somebody else. But Kahn's bathhouse does get built, and he continues these ideas. So here are these little tiny rooms, all done in concrete block, and these are then the structure that holds up these big roofs. And we use them architecturally, so they're hollow. So this wall goes in here, we can go in here and around. So it's a way to go into the men's room or the women's changing room and have privacy without a door. We've got these bold roofs, and so these are the structure holding, in our 4 corners, but it's also architecturally organizing the space. And this idea is going to continue throughout Kahn's work. So here's a stupid little building which he uses to explore some very bold ideas. Now, this isn't held up that well. This is cheap cement blocks, and it sure looks it. But it's now been, if you look at this online, this has been cleaned up. It's been restored. So we're going to get out early today because our last project is Yale University Art Gallery. So in 1951, Kahn is, so he was born in 1901, right? Let's see. Let's just go back and check. Yeah, 1901. So Kahn's 50 years old, and he lives in Philadelphia, but he's teaching at Yale. Now, at Yale, the architecture historian at Yale is Vincent Scully. Very important figure, good friend of Kahn. And there's some interesting people Kahn's interacting with. Painters like Albers, Buckminster Fuller is there for a while. And so Kahn is this kind of a hotshot figure, but he hasn't built anything. There are other architects that are building important buildings. Yale is going to build a new art gallery and architecture school. Now, eventually, it was only the architecture school for a short period of time, and then right here, Paul Rudolph does the architecture building, and we're standing on the roof of that to take this picture. So, anyway, Kahn's trying to get the commission, and he's 50 years old. He hasn't done anything. And Scully says, Lou, you're a great teacher. You're never going to be an architect. Focus on teaching. So, little did anybody know he was about to embark on a career that would make him America's most important architect after Frank Lloyd Wright. So you never know. And architecture in general tends to be a late blooming field. But Kahn was particularly late because he was then 60 before he did his really major important building. This building, it got published, but it wasn't any earth-shaking work. So we've got a boxy building. It is, so this is the Art Museum at Yale, and this is an extension to it. So he makes this little joint here, and then a box of a building. It has glass on this side, glass on the other side. Here's a little bit of Paul Rudolph's architecture building. And then the side we can't see is all glass, and this is all brick. So maybe very influenced by Nice, all glass. And we're emphasizing the structure here, having a strong sense of the structure. So here is the existing building. Here's the joint between the two, and then here's Kahn's building. And this is sort of a kind of continuity of space, but he's trying to emphasize something in the way he renders this plan. So we've got a tetrahedral truss ceiling. And then we've got the middle part and then more of the ceiling. So what he's done here is he's gathered in this middle part what he calls the servant spaces, and these are the served spaces. So the servant spaces are toilets, freight elevator, fire stair, passenger elevator, main stair, which he makes round, this triangular stair inside. And he's been looking at Boulez and Ledoux and getting interested in these bold Roman forms. Here's the structural grid. Again, huge concrete columns. This is, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, maybe 4-story building. These are enough to carry a 10, 20-story building. And he's beefing them up for the architectural effect. In other words, this structure is not only holding up the ceiling, it's also defining this space, differentiating the served space from the servant space. Now this structure, he really did not have a clear idea what he wanted to do. But what it is it's a bunch of basically joists in concrete with this thing in between, which is stiffening for the joist, but really doesn't do anything. So it's this huge, this has about maybe 4 times as much material in it as it needs. Because we're just big beam here, and then we're just spanning across. We don't need all these triangles. But, beginning of an idea here, because what this is going to do is give the ceiling depth, and he's going to be able to put his lighting up here. So we have electrical tracts up here, and then we can plug these hi-hat light fixtures in there. This gives us an open, flexible space for exhibits. And then he makes these big panels. The panels have spring-loaded sort of pogo sticks sticking out of them. So you wedge this panel in, the springs then hold it in place. You can put these panels anywhere on orthogonally or diagonally along this concrete grid. So the ceiling provides the grid for how we can place these panels. So you say the client can adjust the space any way they want. It always sounds like a good idea. It seldom works. And sure enough, the client said, can we just get some permanent partitions in here? And Paul Rudolph, contemporary of Kahn, builds these. Kahn's very teed off. He says, what's he messing with my building? Of course, it's the client's building, but architects don't think that way. So the building, I don't know why there was a problem with it. I mean, it's such elemental materials, just concrete and glass. But it had a major renovation. It's now restored to perfect condition. They brought back Kahn's original pogo stick partitions. And this is a photograph of the way it looks today. Now, he used welded steel forms for these tetrahedral braces, then laid the rebars in there, and then poured the concrete. And then, through the space that these leave, he can thread the air conditioning ducts, the electrical tract lighting, and electrical tracks for the lighting, and then you can snap in these hi-hats into these tracks to get the electricity. Usually what you do is you make a hung ceiling. You have your structure, you have a space, you hang a hung ceiling, and you can just put anything you want in that space. Kahn didn't like that. He says a hung ceiling is like putting cardboard in your building. He wanted the structure to be deep enough to handle the air conditioning and the ducts and the electrical tracks. What's a big problem with the way these ducts are in here? Anybody think of two major limitations to this? What if there's a screw up in the cold air and you get condensation in there and this rusts, gets corroded? How do you get that out of there? And what if you want to, suddenly turn and go this way? It's only one direction. Comes from, so what you can do is, so the air conditioning ducts can start from here and go outward that way, but it can't go out and then turn. He's going to develop this some more in his next building, the medical towers. We'll see next week. So here is a diagram of what we have here. We've got this poured-in-place concrete slab. This is basically the structure, these joists. These don't do anything structurally, they just brace the joists, but they create the space that will hold the ducts for the air conditioning, and then you can snap the lighting fixtures up in here. Then we've got another slab, and we've got a brick, block, space, brick, masonry wall. And we want to space it on masonry wall. Here's the diagrams of how these things are built. Here is this round stair, a round tube with a triangular stair in it. Usually the fire department doesn't like that. They don't want people getting confused running down a stair during a fire. And then on top of this is 3 huge beams, and sitting on top of that is this disc, and then the space of the beam gives you the light coming in, bounces off the beam, and down into the space. We're going to see that again in British Study Center and the Exeter Library. We'll also see here already, it's going to show up more in SALT and other buildings. The bolts that go, okay, you've got formwork, you've got plywood here and here, and you've got to dump concrete in between. That concrete is going to tend to push the plywood apart. So you can brace that plywood from the outside, but you can also put a bolt through there. And that'll keep the plywood from pushing apart. Now, when you take all the plywood off, those bolts are stuck in there. You can't get them out. They're embedded in the concrete. So, but they're indented a little bit. And he makes a point of that pattern of where those bolts were is part of the concrete, part of the aesthetic of what you're seeing. Now, Kahn thinks about what he did and makes a criticism of it. So here is this octagonal grid used in a square building. Well, where's that at? So he says, you know what? Rather than gathering this stuff in here, we could have had the stairs, the columns, be also part of the grid. In other words, a space frame is three-dimensional. So space frame, space frame, space frame, space frame continues. So that the columns are just an extension of the space frame. And then while we're at it, why did I trim an octagonal grid orthogonally? The building should have been an octagon. So this is just a little thought about how he might have made the building more consistent with this orthogonal tetrahedral grid ceiling.